Hello, and welcome to the Pirate History Podcast. Today we're beginning our look at the English colonization of North America, and I don't intend to waste any time. Before the English arrived, though, I do want to give a brief breakdown of the people that were living in the region into which the English would first settle. The Native American people in the region were collectively called the Powhatan people. That was a confederation of Algonquin-speaking people that lived on the coast of modern-day North Carolina. Mainly they lived in and around the Albemarle and Pamlico Sounds. There are three tribes that concern us today. The Roanoke and the Powhatan, the first two, lived on two islands in the bay that the English gave the same names, Roanoke and Powhatan. On the mainland there was another group of tribal peoples who were members of the Powhatan, but they had their own alliance. However, I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce their name, and they won't come into play until later anyway. But then to the south there was another group, a large coalition, almost an empire, of Mississippian indigenous peoples, and they were relatively recently allied with Spain. The conquistador Hernando de Soto explored much of North America up to the Mississippi River. There he made an alliance with the people there, known as the Mississippian people, who are famous for their mound building. Impressive structures from earth and wood, and they had an expansionistic, militaristic foreign policy. Another conquistador, working with their Mississippian allies, founded San Augustine. Those two empires and their alliance controlled most of what would later become the southeast U.S. The only real outliers at this point were a few Native American peoples who lived in the mountains, like the Cherokee, and those like the Roanoke and Powhatan, who lived a bit further away and on the ocean. This alliance between Spain and the Mississippian peoples was troubling for the Algonquins along the coast. It was a danger to them, an existential threat. The Mississippian peoples were already known to be militaristic, but now they had allies with guns. So, when in 1584, two ships led by Walter Raleigh carrying English privateers arrived on their shores, the chief of the Roanoke, a man named Wingina, agreed to a similar alliance with the English. This is episode 150, Roanoke. The Englishmen behind this entire venture are people that we've mostly met before. We've met them during the stories of Francis Drake and the foundation of the East India Company. Almost all of them were West Country men from Plymouth, and all of them were gentlemen adventurers and sea dogs. There were names like John and Richard Hawkins, Walter Raleigh, John Smith, and Christopher Newport. It was Raleigh that said in his argument for the colonization of those American shores, quote, "He that commands the sea commands the trade, and he that is lord of the trade of the world is lord of the wealth of the world." End quote. That's a compelling argument, and it attracted the interests of a number of people in Elizabeth's court, including, notably, Richard Hakluyt, who outlined in his proposal to Queen Elizabeth the plan for their colonization of America. The plan, in his brief and straightforward way, was, quote, 1. To plant the Christian religion. 2. To traffic. 3. To conquer. End quote. And when we say the plan, I want to be clear what we mean here. Down the line, they were going to plant crops and establish plantations and import slaves and export goods. That was going to happen. But that was a very long-distance kind of plan. For now, this was a bunch of radical Protestant privateers and pirates who intended to found a colony from which they could raid the Spanish. They were trying to build a pirate haven. Now, they'd been using the Atlantic coast for a hiding spot for years now, But if they had a base of operations over there, a place with shipyards and food and fresh water that they could use to restock and repair, the rewards that they might win would grow exponentially. This plan would take money from the Spanish, it would bring in new money to the crown, and it would cost Queen Elizabeth nothing. In her eyes, it was a perfect plan, and she smiled her assent. Sir Walter Raleigh began planning immediately. He named his proposed colony to honor the unmarried Queen Elizabeth. He called it Virginia. It's a stunningly poetic name. For the Queen herself, and naming her a virgin was a bit of probably flattering poetic license, but also for the colony. Virginia was going to be England's first colony in the New World. Now, colonization has often been characterized, especially by feminist historians and philosophers, as a violent and singularly penetrative act. And that would describe this bit of colonization perfectly. However, like most first-timers, this was going to be a clumsy and poorly executed affair. Of course, on the other hand, this wasn't really England's first time. For the past decade or so, they had been involved in a bitter war for their first overseas colony. Now, it wasn't in America, it was, kind of a trial run close to home, just across the sea in Ireland. That's the fight that made Grace O'Malley into an Irish folk heroine. It was a brutal war, though, and it taught the English a lot of lessons about conquest and colonization. Pulitzer Prize-winning historian Alan Taylor writes in his exceptional book, American Colonies, quote, "Indeed, the conquest and colonization of Ireland served as the English school for overseas empire. In Ireland, the English developed both the techniques and rhetoric of colonial conquest. The English learned to consider the resisting peoples as dirty, lazy, treacherous, murderous, and pagan savages, little, if any, better than wild animals, and to treat them accordingly. In Virginia, the English employed the same language and meted out the same treatment whenever Indians violated the initial role cast for them. Grateful innocents eager to submit to their superior benefactors. Unwilling to play along, Indians faced the formidable fury of their uninvited guests." End quote. A fleet of 7 ships and 600 men, organized by Hakluyt and Raleigh, left Plymouth on the 9th of April, 1585. The fleet was manned and commanded almost exclusively by West Country men. But the names that were involved which we need to know are 3. Richard Grenville was to command the voyage. Ralph Lane was to serve as governor once the colony was established. And John White, an English artist, was to serve as the cartographer. They were smart to bring him along. His maps have illuminated this story. I should also note, though, that they had a number of scientists and even a metallurgist on board. That makes the mission's true objective clear. They were after gold. The voyage headed south for Africa, and then across the Atlantic to the West Indies, and then finally up to North America. And we need to remember during this entire story that that's how all trade from Western Europe reached the Americas. Traveling west directly across the Atlantic and the North Atlantic wasn't really an option. There are times in this story where that's going to cause great consequences. The spot that the colonists had chosen was carefully picked. The Spanish-Mississippian alliance was a problem for the English, but the outer banks of what we consider today North Carolina and the shifting sandbars and shoals there were an excellent defense against the Spanish. No sensible Spanish ship would approach for fear of running aground. That's why, in the years to come, much less sensible men like Edward Teach and Stede Bonnet and even Charles Vane chose this region as a base of operations. But it was also dangerous for these English colonists. The flagship of the fleet, Tiger, hit one of those sandbars. They managed to salvage the Tiger, but they lost all of the food they had aboard, which was nearly all of their resources. Everyone made it safely, though, to their destination at Roanoke Island. However, due to the loss of food, they had to change some plans. They were going to leave as many as 500 colonists there, but Grenville, in the end, left only 108 men there at Roanoke, including Mr. Lane, the governor, and maybe Mr. White. Nobody's really sure. Grenville left almost immediately to go back to England and collect supplies. But those 108 men left on Roanoke began the construction of a wooden fort. They did so with the full permission of the Roanoke chief, Wingina, but they had to disassemble their ships to do so. That left those 108 colonists without any transportation home. But keep in mind that this was the plan as far as Wingina was concerned. They wanted the English to build a fort and bring in their men and their guns. They wanted them there to aid in defense against Spanish and Mississippian aggression. Chief Wingina even went so far as to give the English that were left on the island enough maize and other food to sustain them through the winter. Now that depleted his own people's resources to dangerously low levels, but it secured the alliance with the English. Still, despite all of that goodwill, the cracks began to show almost immediately. The English, as soon as the fort was built, should have spent their time hunting and fishing. They should have been trying to stock up their stores of food. But they didn't do much of that. Instead, the colonists spent most of their time hassling Wingina. They bothered him about gold deposits and copper deposits. When they weren't actively harassing him, they marched around the mainland looking for mining operations that they assumed these treacherous Indians were clearly hiding. Most troubling of all, though, as soon as the English arrived, Roanoke people began to die. They would occasionally fall prey to a sudden, severe, and almost always deadly illness. Nobody knew what the cause of this was. The Roanoke began to assume treachery or poison or even witchcraft. Of course, we know today that it was the contact of the Roanoke people with all of those old-world pathogens, direct and intimate contact. However, the death of all of these people, the suspicious deaths, began to build a culture of fear and mistrust. It was at this point that Chief Wingina adopted a new name, Pimisapan, which translates to one who watches. When the English inevitably ran out of food, Mr. Lane demanded more maize from the Roanoke people, but they didn't have any more to give. They had only enough left to sustain themselves through the winter, and they didn't have an opportunity to collect more. The English, though, were growing hungry and angry, and at this point, more than anything, they were growing tired of eating corn. So they began to suspect that the Roanoke people were lying, that they were hiding secret caches of salted pork and wine and honey. And in their wild fantasies, all of that delicious food was probably carried on golden platters by beautiful nude women. That's not the case, but people, as they get really, really hungry, start to go a little crazy. So Ralph Lane, in what is one of the most despicable moves in history, led a raiding party against the Roanoke, an event that led to the death of Chief Pimisapan and his top lieutenants. Then Ralph Lane impaled the heads on pikes outside the walls of his fort. The story of American colonization is replete with horror, from the very first Spanish contact on down, but to me, this is America's original sin. The colonists there on Roanoke hoped that killing their chief would scare their neighbors into giving up their secret stores of food that didn't exist. What an absolutely idiotic plan. Of course the Roanoke didn't give them any food. Of course they ran away and took the food that they did have with them. Mainly the Roanoke ran to the nearby island of Powhatan, where they had close friends and brothers. That winter, following the murder of the chief and his lieutenants, proved to be a desperate one for the Roanoke colonists. At least, we can assume it was a desperate winter. We don't really know what happened that winter because no one kept any records. However, at almost the exact same time, Captain Grenville, who was returning to England for supplies, was having much better luck. His flagship Tiger made for the island of Bermuda in the North Atlantic. It was, at the time, an uncolonized island that ships from every European nation used for rest and resupply on their way back home. Off the southern coast of Bermuda, Captain Grenville spotted sails in the distance. Now, the Tiger wasn't a big ship, only 150 tons. She was merely a repurposed ocean-faring galley, but Tiger was well armed. Grenville was a privateer. He was a contemporary of Francis Drake, and he refit his ship, the Tiger, after all of those traditional pirate standards. He made her lightweight and fast and well armed. When they got close enough, the crew of Tiger realized that they were outclassed. They recognized that ship as a Spanish galleon. None of the English knew it yet, but that galleon was the Santa Maria de San Vicente, the flagship of the 1585 Spanish treasure fleet. Now, in 1585, the galleon was still the most powerful ship in the world, and this was the flagship of the treasure fleet. Not only was it a galleon, but it was well armed and specifically well manned. Grenville, though, did not hesitate. He barked out his orders for the guns and the small arms, and then he opened up full sail to rush this Spanish behemoth. Now, the Spanish were caught off guard here. They even fired off a salutatory salvo toward the newcomer, and Grenville took advantage of that. He didn't open fire immediately. He waited until the Tiger crested a wave, and then he gave the order. His guns opened up, and they tore through all of the rigging and the sails on the Spanish ship. They even damaged one of the masts. That very first volley rendered the galleon almost immobile. And we might think, checkmate, battle over, but there were still 250 well-armed Spanish soldiers on board the Santa Maria. And these weren't the regular provincial militia with which pirates would become so familiar on down the road. This was the crew of the flagship of the treasure fleet, the ship that was guarding all of Spain's yearly budget. These soldiers were the best of the best. Boarding the Spanish galleon with his maybe as many as 80 men was out of the question for Captain Grenville. Instead, he chose to circle around the Santa Maria, kind of like a shark circling its prey. Whenever the opportunity presented itself, Captain Grenville opened up with a full broadside against the Spanish, and the galleon was doing the same thing, but they had far fewer opportunities to do so. The galleon only scored a few glancing blows against the Tiger. The privateers were small and fast and hard to hit, especially since the Santa Maria was unable to move. On the other hand, the Tiger, who was very mobile, scored several direct hits against the Santa Maria, and one shot was timed so well that they pierced the hull before the waterline. A subnautical hit is really hard to do. You have to wait until the enemy vessel is listing away from you, that is to say, kind of leaning away, so that the part of their hull that would normally be underwater is above the waterline. At that same moment, your ship has to be listing forward enough, leaning toward them, so that you can aim for that subnautical part of the hull. But you don't want to be listing so far that your guns will hit the water. This was a tricky shot, and Tiger's gunners pulled it off. The defense, though, that the Spanish soldiers on board the Santa Maria put up is impressive, and it's worthy of remembrance. So often on this show, we've seen the Spanish show up to a fight unprepared, underarmed, and often unwilling to fight. I place the blame in almost all of those situations squarely on the imperial leadership. But here, in this fight, Spanish bravery and valor were at their finest. The battle lasted for 3 full days of almost constant fighting. The Spanish ship Santa Maria was sinking. They'd suffered hits to both the hull and the rigging, and their soldiers. The deck of Santa Maria was slick with blood, and the shark was circling. Despite all of that, though, the Spanish fought on, and they were winning. The crew of the Tiger was crumbling. They had a much smaller crew, which gave them far fewer opportunities to rest than the Spanish, and her own hull was at this point also leaking quite badly. It looked as though this battle, that this action off the coast of Bermuda, might just end in disaster. So Captain Grenville resorted to desperate measures. He ordered his 20 best men to board even calling it a raft would be generous, basically some floating wood, but they climbed aboard nonetheless, and they rowed on over to the Santa Maria. And when those 20 soldiers came in close, like the very best pirates that we've seen, they opened up with small arms fire that tore through the defenders standing at the railing. And the English barely made it over to the Santa Maria. As they began their climb to board the galleon, their raft slipped under the water. Still, 20 privateers jumped over the rail with their cutlasses drawn, and they were prepared to fight, if need be, all 250 Spaniards. But there was no need. Those Englishmen saw, when they finally stood on the deck of Santa Maria, that the defenders they had just shot down were the last that the Spanish had to offer. Those had been the final soldiers able to stand and fight. The deck of Santa Maria was strewn with moaning wounded and silent dead. The Santa Maria de San Vicente, the flagship of the Spanish treasure fleet, the pride of the Spanish Navy, surrendered there and then to 20 English privateers. Captain Grenville took command of the Santa Maria and set about to her repair, but he gave the Tiger over to his enemies, to the remaining Spaniards. And to his credit, I like this next bit, Captain Grenville ordered his men, who were mostly hale and healthy, to aid the Spanish in disposing of their dead in accordance with Spanish Catholic naval tradition. Then he accompanied Tiger to the Azores to make sure they were safe and that they weren't going to do anything that would get him in trouble, and he set the Spaniards free. This act of piracy, and it was piracy, the English and Spanish were not yet at war, it pleased Queen Elizabeth a great deal. And it very likely saved the Roanoke colony. You see, there was a question of the profit-to-loss ratio due to the colony. And this capture of the Spanish treasure galleon really tipped the scales. It proved that a colony from which the English could attack Spanish shipping could yield immense profits. And you may have been wondering why the flagship of the Spanish treasure fleet was all alone out there. Where was the fleet? Well, they'd hit a patch of bad weather just a few days earlier. While most of the treasure fleet was able to sail on through the bad weather, the Santa Maria was too heavy. See, she had all of her soldiers and all of her guns on board, but her holds were filled almost to the bursting with precious metals from America. Instead of Capsizing, as was very likely at one point, she'd been forced to heave to and wait out the storm, and that's where Captain Grenville found her. All of that treasure was the cause of a bunch of celebration when Grenville brought it in. He received a hero's welcome in London. And this action off of the coast of Bermuda was among the very final straws that led England to war with Spain. But it wasn't the final straw. That was a piratical voyage to the West Indies led by Sir Francis Drake. If you have an exceptional memory, you might remember that as the voyage on which Francis Drake stumbled upon the bloody and burned and despoiled corpses of a bunch of Huguenots attempting to make a settlement in Florida. Drake was angry about that, and he took revenge for his Protestant brothers against the people of St. Augustine. He burned their fort to the ground. Then he hurried off to check on the English colonists at Roanoke. If they had attacked one Protestant settlement, why not two? And the people of Roanoke were nearly all from his hometown there in Plymouth. He was worried. But when he arrived at Roanoke, he found a substantially smaller populace. During the winter, many had died, and those who were still alive were starving. Drake did what anybody in that situation would do, and he rescued them. They all returned home. But then, only a few days later, relief for the colonists arrived. This was a ship that had been sent by Grenville immediately upon his return to England. It was carrying food and supplies for the colonists. When that ship arrived, though, they found Roanoke abandoned. Drake had just rescued everyone, so they left. But a few weeks later, Grenville himself returned with 600 men and even more supplies. This was intended to be the second wave of colonization. This whole drama kind of reminds me of a comedy of errors. You know, an old play in which a man and his mistress and his wife are all trying to catch each other and keep popping in and out of different doors on stage, always narrowly missing one another. The colonists and Drake didn't know that relief was coming. That first relief mission didn't know that Drake had just rescued the colonists, nor did they know that Grenville was on his way, and Grenville didn't know that Drake or the relief mission had reached Roanoke. However, the lack of people, or even of bodies, there at the colony really perplexed Grenville. I mean, where was everybody? Now, this is not the famous mystery of the lost colony at Roanoke. Everyone knows what happened to these colonists. They arrived back in Plymouth, safe and sound a few weeks later. But Grenville, at this point, didn't know what had happened. And he also didn't know about the murder of the Roanoke chief a few months earlier, or the flight of the Roanoke people. Naturally, when he found the fort abandoned, he went to talk to the Roanoke, their neighbors there on the island. And I can only imagine the eerie feeling that must have begun to creep in when he found not one, but two silent, abandoned settlements. What had happened here? This whole story, the history of Roanoke Island, is surrounded by themes of curses. And I imagine that at this point, those ideas started to creep into Grenville's mind. Now, Grenville was ignorant of the animosity that the locals were feeling toward the English. When he left, they were still on friendly and even allied terms. So he left a token force there at Roanoke. He left a force of only 15 men, but they had more than enough food to last them. It was intended to greet whoever was going to come next. He didn't leave those men because he needed the fort or to guard the food. He left them because, were he to willingly abandon Roanoke, rival English firms would be legally allowed to send their own colonists in to claim Virginia. Those 15 soldiers were kind of like licking a donut that you don't intend to eat right now, but that you want to save for later. I don't do that, by the way, and you shouldn't do that either. And honestly, neither should Grenville. but he didn't yet know it. We might expect that the Roanoke warriors, or even their Powhatan brothers, would be those who sought revenge for the murder of their former chief. But that's not what happened. They stayed there on Powhatan Island. Instead, that coalition of tribes from the mainland, many who had likely seen what happened when the English were allowed to live here, they rode over to Roanoke Island, and, in apparent friendship, two of them approached the fort. The English, under the assumption that they were still friends, remember they didn't know what had happened the previous winter, they went out to greet those approaching the fort. That's when one of those two warriors produced a wooden sword and ran one of the Englishmen through. The English retreated to their fort walls but almost didn't make it. 28 other Native American warriors jumped out and ambushed them before they reached the gates. However, the gunners atop the walls opened fire, chased the warriors back, and allowed the men inside. The Native American warriors fired flaming arrows into the fort, and they struck the warehouse a number of times. They knew where the warehouse was. They knew where the English had put their food, and this was the goal. They also hit another Englishman, who did eventually die. But once they had the warehouse afire, the attackers pulled back and rode away from the island. Now, we know about this attack because of a report that was left by those 13 soldiers there left at Roanoke. But those 13 men were never seen nor heard from again. We don't know what happened to them. We know they didn't starve at Roanoke. It's possible that they lived and escaped and went somewhere else to live happy lives, but we just don't know. Again, this is also not the famous mystery of the Roanoke colony. But there is something ominous growing here, kind of a pattern of death and abandonment. In fact, Sir Walter Raleigh himself was preparing to abandon the project of a colony. But Richard Hakluyt and John White talked him into giving it one more shot. And it's John White that was the key figure in this next attempt. They organized yet another crop of food and supplies and colonists. But this time, instead of 600 soldiers, they brought families, including women and children. One of those women was John White's own daughter, Eleanor, and Eleanor's husband, Ananias Dare. To make everything that is to come even more tragic, Eleanor Dare, along with at least one other woman who was going along, was pregnant. These were 115 middle-class people. Mostly they were from London and Plymouth, and most of them were probably looking to improve their situation. They were looking for opportunity in the New World. And we know their names. We know the names of all of the men and women and children that were preparing for this voyage. There was Ambrose Vickers, his wife Elizabeth, and their son Ambrose Jr. There was Thomas Eliot and his son Robert, Rose Payne, Jane Jones, Emma Meramouth. We know their names, and for some of them we know their stories. They were to be the first wave of a new English colony that was intended to live in peaceful harmony with their Native American neighbors. And that's what the people who were preparing for this voyage believed they were sailing into. They didn't know about the original sin, the murder of that Roanoke chieftain, and the very real possibility that Roanoke Island and the colony they were attempting to build was cursed. The English colony at Roanoke is one of the seminal pieces of American mythology. It's got a little bit of everything. It's got pirates. It's got plucky pioneers struggling to survive. It's got a fight against the British aristocracy. And of course, there's the horrific maltreatment of the Native Americans. Beyond that, it's just a good story. Which is why the story of Roanoke is so often used as fare for YouTube videos and poorly written magazine articles with titles like The Unsolved Mystery of America's First Colony, or at the other extreme, something like Secrets Revealed, What Really Happened at Roanoke, when of course the reality lies somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. We don't know what happened at Roanoke. We have very little data and we have no conclusive evidence. But on the other hand, we definitely know what happened at Roanoke. Imagine that you came home one day and you found a note on the fridge in your kid's handwriting that said, Grandma's house. You would know where the kids are, but that's not proof, of course. You could never really be sure they went to Grandma's house. Even if you got a call from one of your friends saying, yep, they're at Grandma's house, I saw them there this morning, well, you don't have evidence of that. You haven't seen it with your own eyes, so you can't ever really be sure. And of course, hard archaeological scientific data, that's the backbone of the study of history for good reason. But we know what happened at Roanoke. The story I find really interesting is why there's still this idea of a mystery, why it pervades the story of Roanoke, why that's part of the American mythology. Why we still have all of those cryptic headlines and mysterious titles intended simply to gin up interest in Roanoke and generate clicks for historical hacks on the internet. This is episode 151, The Lost Colony. In 1587, the Spanish Empire was really worried about the English colony on Virginia. At the very highest levels they were worried, by which I mean the king, Philip II. And this wasn't some kind of ethereal concern about imperial sovereignty or their rights or the will of God. This was a very solid, tangible, real-world concern, and all of it was due to the threat of piracy. And that's a valid concern for the Spanish. The English were demonized by the Spanish as a nation of pirates. Elizabeth was the pirate queen, but the English absolutely deserved that characterization. Elizabeth was the pirate queen. The Spanish ambassador in London, which was, of course, a tense job even at the best of times, wrote to King Philip of English aspirations at their colony in Virginia. He said, quote, "They have proposed that all pirates who are out of this kingdom, England, will be pardoned if they resort there, Virginia, and the place is so perfect, as they say, for piratical excursions that your majesty will not be able to bring silver from the Indies without finding a great obstacle there, and that they will ruin the trade of your majesty's vassals, for piracy is the purpose of their going there." End quote. And it was proposed at one point that the colony at Virginia be used as a prison colony for pirates. They didn't do that, not yet at least, but it was a terrifying prospect. These concerns were valid. The proof of that was already quite evident. Last time we talked about the action off the coast of Bermuda, in which Captain Richard Grenville, in his ship the Tiger, captured the flagship of the treasure fleet, the Santa Maria. That's the big one. That's the headline-grabbing story. But every voyage to and from Roanoke thus far in this story has involved at least a little piracy. When Walter Raleigh stopped off at Roanoke to negotiate a treaty with the Native Americans there back in 1584, he was on his way back to England after a voyage of piracy. That initial wave of colonists in 1585, we talked about them last time. Well, they captured ships off the coast of Puerto Rico. And when Francis Drake rescued those same colonists, well, he was returning from a voyage of piracy. When Grenville, after taking the Santa Maria, returned back to Roanoke with 600 soldiers, there was piracy. I mean, it was happening all the time. The Spanish ambassador was 100% correct in his assessment, and the English crown didn't even have the shame to deny it. The abuse of the privateer system, of the letters of reprisal, well, that was obvious. But that's kind of the point here. When Queen Elizabeth and her top ambassadors consider punishing all of those pirates by relocating them to Virginia, and they do so in the hearing of the Spanish ambassador, they're doing that on purpose. That plan was a threat to King Philip. Now, there were English thinkers at the time that pretend otherwise. Richard Hakluyt, for example, was a proponent for agricultural colonization, and he wrote in tones of flabbergasted outrage, quote, "Portugal and Spain account all other nations for pirates, rovers, and thieves, which visit any heathen coast that they have sailed by or looked on." End quote. But of course, Portugal and Spain were right, and they would be proved right time and time again in the coming years. By that point, of course, Jamaica would dwarf all other concerns, but until then, Virginia was the boogeyman. I wonder if the Spanish would have been heartened, or maybe even pushed to act, if they knew the kind of trouble that the English were having at their colony at Roanoke. They built a fort and they put cannon emplacements there, and they secured an alliance with the local Roanoke people, but all of that had fallen apart. The English killed the Roanoke chief. They cut off his head. Alliances don't tend to last when you display the head of the people with whom you are supposed to be allied outside the walls of your fort. And then, after all of that, another group of Algonquin people from the mainland attacked the soldiers that were left behind to guard that fort. And that is the very last word we have of Roanoke until 1587. Now, back in England, the investors in this venture were not excited about the prospect of returning. It took a lot of convincing and a bit of bribery and a ton of propaganda to convince those investors to return. Walter Raleigh himself was hesitant to sink yet more time and energy and money and manpower into the colony at Virginia. However, 3 Englishmen were very much interested: Richard Hakluyt, John White, and Thomas Harriot. Now, Hakluyt, of course, we know, and you'll remember John White from last time. He was a cartographer and artist on that first excursion to Roanoke. Thomas Harriot was on that initial expedition as well, and he wrote a pamphlet about the colony at Virginia. The historian Arthur Herman writes in his book To Rule the Waves, quote, "Raleigh used Thomas Harriot's highly tarnished account of the Roanoke settlement, a brief and true report of the new-found land of Virginia, to drown out the critics and raise money for a second try." End quote. And that's true. That brief and true report contained about as much truth as a 1950s advertisement. 9 out of 10 physicians recommend Camel cigarettes and colonizing America. It was all propaganda. But it worked here. And in the few cases where it didn't work, a few well-placed bribes got the job done. Now, these weren't bags of coin we're talking about. We're talking about promises to minor noble families of land in the new colony and exclusive trading rights down the road. And let me tell you, those bribes were going to cause not a small amount of bloodshed and piracy down the road. However, Hakluyt and White and Harriot, they had a more progressive view of the Virginia colony. They envisioned a proper colonial settlement, farmers and family and trade. They wanted something beyond the pirate port that someone like Raleigh envisioned. Now, they also intended to abandon Roanoke. They weren't going to attempt a settlement there. It was too dangerous at this point. Instead, they were going to build a new settlement at Chesapeake Bay, a city that would be called Raleigh. It was a far superior location to the Outer Banks, mostly due to the deep water port they could build there. It would offer proper oceanic trade rather than shifting shoals which would sink ships. It also had the benefit of superior soil for raising crops in the surrounding countryside. Now, John White was the key figure in this second attempt. He organized another crop of food and supplies and colonists. This time, though, that included women and children. One of those women was John White's own daughter, Eleanor, and her husband, Ananias Dare. To make everything that was to come even more tragic, Eleanor Dare was pregnant. And she wasn't the only pregnant woman on the voyage either. You see, these colonists weren't a military detachment as the previous crop had been. They were families, middle-class families from London and Plymouth. They were just people looking for opportunity in the New World. And that's bold, even dangerous. See, a military detachment would be able to defend themselves against the Spanish, and they were technically building on Spanish territory. It was almost certain that at some point the Spanish would find them. But what kind of monsters would Spain be if they attacked a settlement that was almost entirely families filled with women and children? And, were that to happen, what kind of retaliation would England be honor-bound to offer back? If the colonists get away with it, great. The English have a new colony in America. But if they don't, and Spain butchers all of those women and children or puts them in chains, well, then England would have a license, in the eyes of the international community, to declare war on Spain and unleash hell. They would have France and the Netherlands and probably Portugal and maybe Italy and parts of Germany on their side. It would have been quite a win. But of course that's not what happened. The fleet consisted of 3 ships. The flagship Lion, which was technically captained by John White. He was the commander of this voyage. But it wasn't really under John White. The ship's master and Portuguese pilot, Simón Fernandez, was really in charge on board the Lion. And, in the eyes of the crew at least, John White was merely a passenger. Then there was a full-rigged pinnace under Edward Stafford. That's a ship that we might see as akin to a sloop of war. It's very similar to what a lot of pirate ships would look like, only this one had square rigging. It was small and sleek and filled with guns. That pinnace belonged to the Lion, and Edward Stafford was one of Simón Fernandez's men. And then there was a flyboat under Captain Edward Spicer. Now the flyboat was not associated with Simón Fernandez. It actually belonged to John White, which is important here. The voyage set out on the 8th of May, 1587, and made for Africa and then the West Indies. And as has become customary on these voyages, they engaged in a bit of light piracy. While the colonists are on this voyage, though, I'd like to take a brief intermission to talk about Simón Fernandez and his infamous career. Fernandez was born in the Azores and trained at an illustrious Spanish naval institute. He trained to be a pilot and a petty officer. He wasn't nearly noble enough to be one of the higher-ups, but he was a skilled sailor and proved to be quite the leader of men. In fact, he served as a pilot on at least one Atlantic crossing of the Spanish treasure fleet back in the 1560s. But as ties between Portugal and Spain began to weaken, and as war eventually broke out between Portugal and Spain, Simón Fernandez left his Spanish service, and he sailed for England. There he joined forces with a Welsh pirate named John Callis. Now Callis was never a privateer. He was always a pirate, and he liked it better that way. He wasn't terribly fond of the English crown, but he was smart enough to avoid attacking English shipping. Instead, he attacked almost exclusively Spanish ships and sold his cargo back in Wales. Together, John Callis and Simón Fernandez sailed up and down the Bay of Biscay, raiding any Spanish shipping they could find. They enriched a lot of Welsh businessmen in the process as well. They were popular back in Wales. Even though this was very much illegal, Elizabeth wasn't exactly inclined to work very hard at capturing pirates who operated against the Spanish. However, when the situation with Spain and England grew dire, Elizabeth had to do something. She had to deal with all of those pirates who infested her coasts. She sent a fleet out hunting, and even though it took some time, that fleet finally tracked the pirates down in 1576. Now they captured the Swallow and arrested John Callis, but Simón Fernandez escaped. Callis attempted to argue his case, saying that he never worked against the English, and in fact, he would be willing to work for the crown. But those pleas fell on deaf ears. He was the figurehead, he was the Blackbeard of this pirate fleet. He had to be executed to show the Spanish exactly how serious the English were about the pirate menace. So Callis was hanged in Newport only a few weeks later. But Fernandez and the other remnants of that pirate fleet, well, Queen Elizabeth, or really more specifically Walsingham, had other ideas about them. When they were finally tracked down a few months later in 1577, they were arrested, but instead of being executed, they were offered jobs. Fernandez and his crew worked for Sir Humphrey Gilbert, and later on for Walter Raleigh and even Richard Grenville. A few of them at one point sailed under Francis Drake. This crew of Simon Fernandez were involved in at least half a dozen major transatlantic privateering raids. The same Spanish ambassador that we quoted earlier wrote of Fernandez, quote, "They are taking with them one Simon Fernandez, a Portuguese, a thorough-paced scoundrel who has given and is giving them much information about that coast, which he knows very well." End quote. As it turns out, privateering suited Simon Fernandez and his crew. They did very, very good work. They did so with royal approval, but, well, look, if you train a wolf to hunt with you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you've tamed the wolf. They're there for the meat, not for your company. So in a stroke of absolute brilliance, Walter Raleigh assigned this crew of famously murderous pirates turned privateers to ferry a bunch of women and children across the Atlantic. How exciting. And profitable. I mean, this is a terrible job for a bunch of pirates. Still, though, the colonists did make it across the Atlantic safe and sound. The flyboat did get blown off course in a storm, but there was nothing that Simon Fernandez could do about that. The Lion and the pinnace that sailed with it arrived at Roanoke on the 22nd of July, 1587. This stop at Roanoke was a planned stop. This wasn't going to be their home, but John White intended to go ashore to meet with those soldiers who were definitely still alive there and to inform them of the plan. Maybe he intended to take those soldiers along with him to the Chesapeake, or there's even some question as to whether the colonists intended to use Roanoke as a base, a place where they could stop while the rest of the ships went out looking for a proper place to colonize. Whatever the plan was, though, it really doesn't matter. John White disembarked the Lion and got on board the pinnace with 40 of his men. They were just going to go ashore for their brief stop, but Captain Stafford of the pinnace informed John White that there had been a change in the plan. Simon Fernandez made the decision to drop them all off at Roanoke. Now, Fernandez wasn't a monster. His ships spent the day ferrying women and children and property and supplies and basically everything they owned over to the shores, but it was still an awful betrayal. His ships were supposed to stay there and help them found a settlement, and then, once they had done so, they were supposed to go back to England with news of, where they were, and he was supposed to leave the pinnace just in case they all needed to escape. Instead, he dumped them all on Roanoke, and then he left. He sailed south down to the West Indies in search of easy riches and Spanish booty. Now, there are some records of Simon Fernandez's cruises in 1587, but nothing worth noting. And I'd like to characterize this as pirates doing pirate things. That's what you get when you employ a crew of murderous buccaneers, but there might be more to it than that. Back in London, there was this rift growing among Queen Elizabeth's gentlemen adventurers. Walter Raleigh, in particular, was not popular. It's possible, and it's been speculated by several reputable historians, that Simon Fernandez might have been paid to sabotage Raleigh's plan to colonize the Chesapeake. If he failed to do so in a timely manner, that means some of those other adventurers might get the opportunity. Of course, that's what happened, but we can't know whether or not Fernandez was in on it. When Fernandez and the other pirates finally left, 60 colonists stood on the shore of a tiny island across the ocean from their homes with no way back. That's not a great situation, but there's a reason I called them plucky pioneers. They might not have a ship home. They might be living among people who really didn't like them. But they did have all of this food and all of these supplies, and once they found the fort there on Roanoke, and it was somewhere around there, they could reasonably expect to find those few soldiers had a garden going. They might know where the best fishing spots and hunting grounds are, and, oh, by the way, they already had a fort. This all might just work out. The next morning, the colonists found the fort, Fort Lane, as it was known. But none of those dreams were realized. Fort Lane had been gutted. There were no homes inside, no warehouse, no smithy, no food, no people, just walls. The only sign they saw of any human life was a human skeleton, which was ominous. Now, most people in the years to follow have assumed that the skeleton belonged to the one soldier who was killed inside the fort during their battle. But then what about the survivors of that battle, the remaining 13? By the way, a seriously unlucky number to the English, especially English mariners. Well, these colonists didn't know what happened to those other 13, and neither do we, but it certainly looked like a bad omen. But then, a few days later, some very welcome good news arrived. The last ship in the fleet, that flyboat, arrived there at Roanoke, carrying the rest of the colonists, which does suggest that they knew the plan was to land at Roanoke, and perhaps that they did intend to stay there for a while. Now, everyone was happy to see one another, as well as happy to see the arrival of their ship. Unlike the other ships, this one, belonging to John White, was going to stick around. It was a very, very welcome piece of news. But it wasn't salvation. The flyboat could carry some of the colonists back across the ocean, but it was too small to carry everyone. And as the days passed, it began to look more and more like they might need a lifeboat. A few days after they arrived, the flyboat, a colonist named George Howe was out hunting crabs on the coast of the mainland across the water. While doing so, George Howe was killed by a human being. Governor White took all the right steps in the wake of such an event. As soon as everyone was settled, he sent some of his officers over to Powhatan Island, just across the water, to investigate the murder, as well as to, announce their presence and hopefully to negotiate a treaty. The Powhatan explained that they were neither behind the attack on those 15 soldiers, nor were they behind George Howe's murder. Those who were behind those attacks were a coalition of shore-bound peoples who we've made reference to already. The negotiations between the Powhatan and the English went well, and the Powhatan promised peace, even friendship, but not an alliance. Their last alliance had ended poorly. Now, they weren't necessarily opposed to the idea, but they had to discuss it amongst themselves. Governor White agreed, and in good spirits he left Powhatan Island. But then, Governor White led a party of armed men to the mainland to attack those who had killed George Howe. It's debatable as to whether or not this was the right move. The logic behind it seems sound. They had proved their willingness to kill. But it appeared to be abandoned. Upon closer inspection, though, they did find a few men hiding out. I can see how it must have looked like an ambush at the time, and the English, thinking that was the case, killed them. The English attacked before dawn, and it was only later, in the full light of day, that John White realized his mistake. He wrote in his journal later that day, quote, "We were deceived, for the savages were our friends," end quote. Those they had killed were young Powhatan men, little more than boys, really, that were searching the abandoned village for tools or food or whatever they could find there. See, the shorebound tribes had fled 2 or 3 days earlier because they feared the reprisal that would come for George Howe's death, which very likely wasn't murder, or at least not a premeditated murder. It's very likely, considering what a short amount of time the English had been there so far, that George Howe, surprised, as well as was surprised by, a Secotan man also out hunting crabs, who killed him out of fear. This was a series of disastrous accidents and killings that deteriorated relations between the English and the Native American population almost immediately. Things were looking grim for the Roanoke colonists. But then, a few weeks later, the colonists had their first happy news in some time. Eleanor Dare gave birth to a healthy baby girl. She was the first English child born on American soil, and the colonists named her Virginia. It's become a piece of American mythology. In fact, the county in which Roanoke resides is today called Dare County. However, their situation was still dire. The colonists there were trapped, essentially. They had their small flyboat, which could help a few of them escape, but not everyone. And they had no way to escape by land since they were surrounded by peoples who wanted to kill them. They needed supplies, and they needed ships to take them away, and both of them they needed desperately. So the settlers urged John White to take the flyboat back to England and gather those necessities, to tell Walter Raleigh about their situation and about the pirate who had abandoned them. White, though, didn't want to do it. He didn't want to abandon his daughter and his granddaughter, and more than that, he worried that upon arriving in England, he would be branded a deserter. But Eleanor herself, his daughter, begged him to go, so John White eventually relented, and he departed for England on the 27th of August, 1587. And that's a significant date here. See, just about 3 months earlier, when John White was completely out of the loop, getting no news from the outside world, Sir Francis Drake sailed from England to Spain. He sailed on Cadiz, which is where Spain's biggest shipyards were, and he burned the Spanish fleet. Then he attacked several coastal forts and finally captured yet another Spanish treasure galleon. It was a major endeavor. It's known today as the singeing of the King of Spain's beard, and it signaled the outbreak of open naval hostilities between England and Spain. That's when the Spanish ordered all English ships in their ports captured. In the immediate aftermath, the rumors and then eventually the news of a massing Spanish armada intended to invade gripped the people of England. Elizabeth prudently announced a stay of shipping. She barred any ships that were suitable for the defense of England from leaving England. Her reasons were clear. She did so due to the, quote, invincible fleets made by the King of Spain for the invading of England, end quote. However, when John White arrived in Plymouth, he learned about this stay of shipping and learned that his ship was also included. He would have to stay, or at least his ship would have to stay. Now, Walter Raleigh did intercede with the Queen on behalf of John White and the Virginia colonists. He argued that they needed their help right now. But Queen Elizabeth denied his request, and personally I think she was right to do so. White, though, did manage to cobble together 2 ships that were deemed unsuitable for the defense of England, the Brave and the Roe. They embarked on a voyage to get back to the Roanoke colony with plenty of supplies and a way home. But just outside of Morocco, those ships were intercepted by Sallee rovers flying the Sallee Rouge. That is, of course, a coalition of French and North African Barbary pirates who had no love for England. They stole all of the food and all of the powder and all of the shot aboard those ships, as well as their dignity. John White wrote that he was hit, quote, in the side of the buttock, end quote. They left them their vessels, but they were incapable of making it across the Atlantic now. White was forced to return to England and to wait until after the Spanish Armada had failed to land and that the threat of the Armada had finally abated. It was 3 years after leaving Roanoke, in March of the year 1590, when John White finally departed England once again. Now his hopes were not high. He knew that the chances of the Roanoke colonists were low, and during the voyage he was halted over and over again. There were other attacks by foreign pirates, and there were attacks by his ships upon foreign shipping. But White did finally arrive at the Outer Banks, but his fears were realized. The fort, Fort Lane, and Roanoke Island were silent, desolate, completely abandoned. No English person knew about this at the time, but a Spanish naval squadron, back in 1588, shortly before the attempted invasion, had been dispatched from San Augustine to look for the English pirate haven that had launched the attack on the Santa Maria. They searched the Chesapeake first because that's where any sensible person would place a fort, but they obviously didn't find anything. Then, though, they did stumble upon the fort at Roanoke. But even back in 1588, 2 years before John White arrived again, the fortress was abandoned. It appears that only a mere few months after arriving at Roanoke, those 115 colonists, or however many were left, disappeared. John White investigated but found only 2 pieces of evidence. First, there was a relatively fresh set of footprints, but then there were these 2 cryptic messages which have fascinated and intrigued people on both sides of the Atlantic for centuries now. There were messages scrawled on 2 separate posts at opposite ends of the fort. On the first one were 3 letters, C-R-O, and on the other, a much more clear message, Croatoan. I wonder what it could all mean. A real mystery we have on our hands. Perhaps no one will ever be able to decipher these cryptic messages, except of course we know what it means, and John White knew what it meant at the time. See, he knew better than anyone what these messages meant, because he had developed a system of symbols to communicate should anything bad befall the colony. He knew he might not make it back before they had to leave. And one thing is very notable here. If the colonists were attacked or feared abduction or forced to leave by outside forces, they were to scratch a cross into those same 2 posts. But there was no cross. Just the word Croatoan. White knew, as soon as he saw those letters, that his family, his daughter and his granddaughter, and all of the other colonists were at the Croatan village just across the bay. They'd left a note on the fridge telling him where they were, and they were telling him that they had left willingly. They were not forced out of their homes. This was, in John White's mind, excellent news. As soon as the sun rose, he intended to sail over there and rescue everyone. This was the best situation he could have hoped for. But then, in the night, their anchor cable broke. His ship was pushed away from shore by the wind, unable to return to American shores. John White never made it back to the colony at Roanoke, or indeed to America at all. He did publish a book of maps a few years later that would be useful to those who followed in the footsteps of the Roanoke colonists. Those maps were helpful, but none of them ever managed to decipher the mystery of the lost colony of Roanoke. But I've got the answer right here. In fact, it's quite simple. Sir Walter Raleigh was a liar and a scumbag. He made several trips across the Atlantic purportedly looking for the colonists, but, legally speaking, if he investigated and found what we all believe to be the truth, that the colonists had abandoned Roanoke, he would lose his rights to the Virginia colony. That's why those 15 soldiers had been left there years earlier. And if Raleigh investigated and found that all of the colonists were dead, he would also lose all of his rights to Virginia. If, however, he investigated, but all of his attempts to locate the colonists ended in mysterious, inconclusive circumstances, that would allow Sir Walter Raleigh to maintain his monopoly, which is what happened. Of course, His monopoly would only last until 1603, at which point King James I threw Sir Walter Raleigh in prison for treason. And in the wake of his arrest and fall from honor, all of those other interested parties who were chomping at the bit to get a piece of that American land, well, the floodgates opened. 20 years after our last records of the colonists at Roanoke end, a man named Christopher Newport would hear tales, while exploring the American mainland, of men in Native American villages wearing European clothes, of men who carried swords and even had guns living with some of the tribes in the region. And there were one people in the area who were noted for their occasional gray eyes and blonde hair and light skin. None of that is definitive proof of what may have happened to the Roanoke colonists. We don't have proof of anything, but, put all together, it does look very much that the colonists at Roanoke fled across the water to Powhatan Island, where they were taken in. We can imagine, as did John White until his dying day, that Virginia Dare and all of the other colonists had the opportunity to grow up and live long and happy lives. The characters we're going to discuss today, the two main characters at least, and really the story itself, are all extensions of the discussion we had about the English East India Company. Now, that company doesn't play a role in today's story, but there are connections there. The Virginia Company shared a bunch of investors and shareholders and officials and even naval commanders with the East India Company. We're going to begin with one of my favorite characters, Christopher Newport. Now, Newport was not a pirate. He was a loyal and law-abiding privateer. But he has all the trappings of a pirate. You know, in his youth, he was a dashing, charming, handsome, talented sailor. He had that Shakespearean goatee and mustache combination that was so popular with Elizabethans and modern-day hipsters. But he could fence and he could dance, and he was literate. He knew how to read and write. And he also knew how to charm an audience with his tales. Suffice it to say, whenever this good-looking young rogue arrived in court or in port, he was very popular. As Christopher Newport aged, he grew into the figure of the old captain. He grew a big beard and scars on his face and lost one of his arms, which he replaced with a hook. But I think my favorite part of piratical cachet that Christopher Newport carried is his position, the position in which he usually found himself. Christopher Newport was almost always the underdog. Despite that, though, he almost always came out on top, through either his sheer force of will or his formidable talent, and when he failed, he did so with style. Now, his career looked very much like a pirate's career. You know, he was a privateer, during the war at least, but he followed a code on his vessels that looks not dissimilar to latter pirate codes. For example, corporal punishment. It wasn't outright banned on his ship, but he usually left the decisions of guilt and punishment up to the crew, unless they offended him personally. He followed orders when they were handed down to him, but when he was left to his own devices, Christopher Newport looks like Henry Morgan. He captured the Madre de Dios. That was the richest and grandest haul in all of the 1500s. And then in 1605, under a new king, Christopher Newport attempted an invasion of Spanish Jamaica. And it was almost successful. He was repelled, but he very nearly won the island for England 50 years before the Morgan family would invade. Christopher Newport is impressive, and he's fun. He had quite a career. But he intersects with our story today when King James I granted a charter to the Virginia Company in 1606. The shareholders of that Virginia Company of London were rich. They were usually powerful landed aristocrats, but even those that weren't members of the aristocracy were so rich that no one dared mention it, at least not to their face. The Virginia Company's governing body wrote a secret charter for the company's first voyage. They were sealed and handed to Christopher Newport, but nobody but those who had written the charter knew what they said, not even Newport. All they told Newport was that he was to command their maiden voyage to America and unseal their commands once they reached Virginia. Newport gathered his fleet of 3 ships that carried 105 men. Now it carried only men. This was a voyage of soldiers and hunters and construction workers, very much like the first voyage to the Roanoke colony. The 120-ton Susan Constant was the flagship of that fleet, and it was commanded by Admiral Newport. The smallest ship in the fleet was the 20-ton Discovery, but then there was the 40-ton Godspeed. And the Godspeed was captained by our next player in today's story, John Smith. This is episode 152, An Ambitious, Unworthy, Vainglorious Fellow. I'm going to be upfront about this. I don't like John Smith as much as I like Christopher Newport. In fact, I don't like John Smith at all. Although I should, at least on paper, like John Smith. He lived an amazing life. At 16, John Smith left home to fight as a mercenary in the Huguenot forces of King Henry IV of France, and then, when that war was over, he went to fight for William the Silent in the Dutch Revolt. And then he sailed south to the Mediterranean to join the Barbary pirates that were sailing out of Salé, and he earned honors and recognition within the ranks of the Ottoman Empire through his feats of battle. I could have told the story of the 1500s through his eyes, but I don't want to, because I don't like John Smith. A large part of the reason that I dislike John Smith so much is because of his role in this story. On their voyage to America, when they were stopped at the Canary Islands, John Smith attempted a mutiny against Christopher Newport. Now that's not the bad thing. I mean, I'm always in favor of a good mutiny pulled off by an accomplished pirate. Of course, he didn't pull it off. Smith failed in his mutiny, and there at the Canary Islands he was arrested and clapped in irons. John Smith himself wrote his own account of what happened there in the third person, as he was fond of doing. He said that he had been, quote, restrained as a prisoner upon the scandalous suggestions of some of the chief people envying his repute, who feigned he intended to usurp the government, murder the council, and make himself king, that his confederates were dispersed in all 3 ships, and that divers of his confederates that revealed it would affirm it. For this he was committed as prisoner. 13 weeks he remained thus. End quote. In John Smith's account, everyone, from Christopher Newport on down to his own confederates, were all lying about him and his true intentions. They all said he intended to murder the council and make himself king, but that is absolutely ridiculous. In John Smith's view, Christopher Newport, not giving his men the option in this case, sentenced him to hang once they reached American shores. The fleet entered Chesapeake Bay on the 26th of April, 1607. Their very first landfall, known to history as their first landing, was at the southern cape of the bay called Cape Henry. They named it that after King James' eldest son, and also his presumptive heir. The North Cape, on the other hand, was called Charles, after the son who would go on to be Charles I, but they didn't name that till later. There at Cape Henry, Christopher Newport was preparing to hang John Smith for his attempted mutiny, but while everything was being prepared, Newport did as ordered and opened the charter from his bosses back in London. And that was impeccable timing, at least as far as John Smith was concerned. The Virginia Company shareholders had named him to the Council of Virginia, and for Christopher Newport, even as the admiral of the voyage, to hang one of the councilmen on his first day in America, well, that didn't look good. So John Smith went free, to the sorrow of everyone in Virginia, the colonists and the Native Americans. It's easy to like Christopher Newport on the one hand and demonize John Smith on the other, strictly based upon their treatment of Native Americans. I have a biography of Chris Newport that reads, quote, "Captain Newport treated Indians with respect and attempted to win their cooperation through trading rather than using physical force to subdue them. Unlike John Smith and other military leaders of the Virginia colony, he did not attack the Indians or steal food from them, nor did he enslave them." End quote. And that's all true, but it's a bit simplified. There are complexities to that quote and, honestly, that book don't dive into. First, we need to realize that Christopher Newport was a naval commander. He didn't spend that much time in Virginia, and when he was there, he spent most of his time building shipyards. Now, Christopher Newport was the first commander in Virginia to make contact with the Native Americans living nearby, the Powhatan people. We'll get to them in a minute. And he did trade with them. He did earn at least a moderate amount of trust. But that was really his only dealings with the Powhatan people. It's entirely possible that, given time and opportunity, Christopher Newport would have stepped on the same cultural landmines as John Smith did. However, Newport, being so commonly away from the colony, didn't dictate policy, and John Smith did. And thus he is guilty of all kinds of abuses against the Native American peoples. It was those abuses, as well as John Smith's treatment of the colonists there in Jamestown, that would lead one of his contemporaries to dub him an ambitious, unworthy, and vainglorious fellow. And it wasn't just any contemporary, it was a man named George Percy who would follow John Smith as the president of the Council of Jamestown, the man who will have to live with the fallout of the events that will concern us over the next couple of weeks. But before we get to that, all of these colonists had a job to do in Virginia. After naming the council members for the colony, the shareholders ordered them to choose a site for their settlement that was far enough inland that passing Spanish ships wouldn't notice them. But that site also had to have access to the sea and preferably a deep-water harbor. Now, the site had to be defensible from any Native American tribes that might attack by land, but they had to be close enough to land that they could easily move to the mainland for any military or agricultural or further colonial aims. All of those goals seem to be in conflict with one another. They're contradictory. But they were also necessary. So the settlers chose the best site that they could find, despite the flaws that would soon become quite apparent. Take a look at a map of coastal Virginia for me. Chesapeake Bay is fed by dozens of rivers, maybe hundreds of smaller tributaries. But the bay itself has 4 primary rivers that lead east. Their names are essentially the story of early English colonization. We'll get to those. But these colonists chose the southernmost river, and they named it the James. That would be the site, deep, deep down the river, of their colony called Jamestown. The English, of course, also gave us names like Spanish Town and Port Royal and Fort Charles. They weren't the most original when it came to names. But the site they chose for Jamestown was on the tip of a peninsula feeding into the James River. Any passing ships that weren't, for some reason, traveling down the James River would not notice them, but it did have a deep-water harbor nearby where a port could be built, giving access to the sea. It was a good location. The real coup in all of this was another river, what they called the Back River, because, get this, it was in the back, but the Back River separated the tip of that peninsula from the mainland. Now, it's not a huge river as far as the other waterways in the region were concerned, but it was enough to offer that tip of the peninsula a very defensible position from anyone who might attack by land. Now, the early days of the Jamestown settlement aren't really that relevant. They did everything that you might expect them to do. They built walls and topped them with cannon, making a fort. They built a warehouse and a church and shelter for the colonists. It was all necessary work. But I want to take a moment here to talk about the people that were living in this region already, the Powhatan people. Now, I call them the Powhatan people, but that's not exactly accurate. Really, they should be called the Powhatan Confederacy, which was a coalition of smaller tribes that were organized under the High Chief Powhatan. Now, I like the High Chief. He reminds me in a lot of ways of Vercingetorix, the Celtic leader who unified Gaul against Julius Caesar. The Powhatan, of course, were not as militarily powerful as the Gallic people, nor as populous, but, the English weren't exactly the Romans either. But the spirit here is very much the same. This is an indigenous people that is under threat from outside forces. For the Gauls, there were the Germans threatening them from across the Rhine, and for the Powhatan, there was the Mississippi Confederation that was coming up from the south. Both of them made alliances with foreign, militarily strong powers, the English and the Romans respectively, and both of those alliances turned out to be dangerous. And I mean existentially dangerous for the people there. But the Powhatan knew that they were coming. Previous voyages that were not full of colonists had agreed to buy a piece of land in the region from the Powhatan people. The English did this with their permission. And then Christopher Newport met with the chief's eldest son and traded with him, setting the groundwork for peaceful cohabitation and even the possibility of an alliance. At the beginning, things were looking up, and the Powhatan very kindly sent some of their men to the English to help them establish their colony. But it was John Smith that screwed everything up. At this point, Christopher Newport had left the colony. He was going back to England to gather supplies and more colonists. And John Smith wasn't the president of the council, but he was the one who made this decision. To understand how exactly John Smith so offended the Powhatan people, we should take a moment to look at some of their traditions. First, let's talk about Native American warfare amongst the woodland peoples. Before the arrival of guns and horses, the woodland tribes fought with bows, spears, javelins, and shields. It looked kind of like European warfare, minus the guns. They had shield walls and spear formations and arrow volleys. However, that was only in the big battles. Most fighting done by Native American peoples was done by small raiding parties, groups of people that would sneak in during the dark of night to steal food and booze and weapons, and human beings. There have been correlations drawn between the pirates consorting with indigenous peoples and their early adoption of what looked quite a lot like indigenous tactics. But the goals were different. When woodland tribes raided one another, they did so not to massacre or to utterly defeat one's enemies, but to humiliate their foes, to show their superiority over the enemy, and to take their women. War is all about resources like land and food and money. Modern-day war has a lot more to do with rare earth minerals, but the key resource in tribal warfare was always women. That's something that societies lose as they advance in size. Once communities have a large enough gene pool that they no longer have to rely on outside sources, they no longer have to capture foreign women. But it's something that we see not just from the Native Americans, but from tribal societies of all stripes. Take Vercingetorix. His Celtic Gauls and the Germans nearby did that sort of thing all the time. But it wasn't killing all the men and burning their village and carrying the women away in chains. That total warfare wasn't how things were done. It was a real fight. People bled and people died in these battles, but the victors walked away with resources, as much as they could carry, and new brides. And, at least in the case of the woodland tribes, they were brides, not slaves. I really have a hard time wrapping my head around that. I don't know that I can understand how those women must have felt. I can't imagine that they were thrilled about it, but they weren't held in captivity. They weren't resigned to their unhappy fate. Most Native American women who lived under circumstances like that seemed to accept their new lives and their new husbands. And we see this sort of thing later on in the American West. There would be pioneer girls who were carried off after an Indian raid, but oftentimes they would be found years later with husbands and children. And often they didn't want to leave. And of course that's not always how things went. There are old ideas like the noble savage ideal, and of course there are drastic differences between different nations and tribal people, but I personally think that it's a question of values. We might find behavior like that unacceptable, amoral even, but to those women who had been captured, their new husbands had just proved themselves to be brave, capable warriors. They proved that they could be protectors and providers. But then again, just because many of these women were satisfied with their new accommodations, we shouldn't assume that life was great. We can't paint with the utopian brush here. I mean, life was hard, and women in these societies were second-class citizens. It looks once again like Gallic or Nordic tribal peoples. And the way that their women were treated often looks almost progressive compared to, the Roman people or even the English of the era in which we're speaking. But it wasn't really. Those women still had duties that they had to adhere to. They had to bear children and raise them, and they had to carry stuff. When they were on the move, as tribal peoples often were, the men had to be ready to defend everyone. And the women had to do the cooking and preserving and the fire tending and all of those domestic duties. And they had to do the farming, and I want you to pay attention to the farming, because, at least among the eastern woodland tribes, it was strictly a woman's job. Meanwhile, the men had to be prepared to fight, but they only actually fought very occasionally. Most of the time they were hunting or fishing, or building canoes, or riding around in the canoes that they had just built. Come to think of it, that sounds like a perfectly equitable society to me, even an ideal towards which I think we should all work. But I bring all of that up because John Smith made a huge mistake here. He, with those Powhatan men who had been sent to aid these new colonials, he put those men to work in the fields, which admittedly was necessary work. They had to sow and till. They were trying to grow crops to eat. But those men, those Powhatan men, I don't think they would have minded any other sort of work, hunting or fishing or scouting or even helping to build their structures. They would have been fine with that. But instead they were made to farm. And gender roles today aren't nearly as strong as they were in the past, and they're nothing compared to what they were in tribal societies, but I have trouble even coming up with a good analogy that would make sense to modern people. However, being made to farm in the eyes of these Powhatan men was an affront to their masculinity, to their pride, to their honor, and even to their society. The English had turned these men into women, and that suggested that they thought of the Powhatan as second-class citizens. As soon as this state of affairs became apparent, relations with the Powhatan immediately soured. They stopped trading with the English, and they attacked the fort to rescue those men who were... Well, there are a lot of euphemisms that one hears about the status of those Powhatan men. They're servants or indentured servants even, or I've seen volunteer laborers before. If that was really the case, then why did a party of Powhatan warriors who were friends with the English just a few months earlier, why did they raid the fort in an attempt to rescue those men? The Powhatan were slaves. The English, John Smith in particular, yeah, but the English as a whole were just arrogant enough to assume that the Powhatan had realized their apparent inferiority and just given them slaves. They saw nothing wrong with what they had done, and they saw it as a betrayal when the Powhatan attacked them. Near the end of 1607, in December, Christopher Newport returned to the colony at Jamestown, and he was appalled at what he saw there. While he had been gone, about 62 people had died. There were only 38 Englishmen left alive in Jamestown. Now, some had died in attacks from the Powhatan, but most had starved to death. We know that Newport was confused. We know he was furious and that he demanded answers. And we know that John Smith told him tales of the treacherous Powhatan and their many raids. But we don't have Christopher Newport's thoughts on the validity of that explanation. Still, Newport brought in a ton of food for the colonists and a few more cannons to help bulk up their defenses. There were muskets as well, and 100 additional men. 2 women came with him as well. This was just the shot in the arm that Jamestown needed, and by April they seemed to be up and running again. So, once the colony seemed to be in good working order, Newport left on yet another supply run. His ships were filled with the colony's only export thus far, which he was thrilled with at the time. He had hundreds of pounds of gold. But of course, it was only fool's gold. It was pyrite. That's why the settlers had had so much trouble growing food. They were busy prospecting fool's gold. Still, after Christopher Newport's visit, the colonists did appear to attempt real agriculture, enough food to keep them on their feet. It's around this time that we hear John Smith's maxim, "He who does not work will not eat." In August, John Smith left Jamestown to go out and explore the Chesapeake. It was a voyage of exploration, but it was also an attempt to find other sources of food, other tribes that weren't affiliated with the Powhatan to trade with him. Now, he did find one group willing to trade, but it took about a month to reach them, and they didn't have much surplus. On their way back to Jamestown, John Smith and his party were attacked by Powhatan warriors. And about this time, we run into a problem. We have a really hard time discerning fact from fiction. See, we really only have the one account of everything that happened at Jamestown, and that's the account of John Smith. Now, we have dissent from virtually every other literate man that survived, but they don't give their own records. Generations of historians have tried to conjure the truth of what may have really happened over the following months, but there aren't any Powhatan records to compare it with. Really, we only have John Smith's account, and I, for one, don't believe a word of it. And I'm really not alone. Smith tells us that the English were attacked and ambushed on a march inland All of his men were killed, but Smith managed to survive by taking one of the Powhatan warriors prisoner. It was apparently one of the chief's sons. Smith used that warrior as a human shield and negotiated his way back to Chief Powhatan. The chief, though, as you might imagine when his son was used as a human shield, was incensed and demanded the immediate execution of John Smith. Warriors grabbed him, tied him on posts to the ground, and prepared to execute him with a club. But right then, the chief's 13-year-old daughter, Pocahontas, interceded. I'll let John Smith himself tell it. He writes, quote, "At the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father that I was safely conducted to Jamestown." End quote. Some historians have suggested that this was a ceremonial event. Once John Smith's men were defeated and killed, they took him to a ceremonial execution in which it was a woman's job to save the foreign commander, that is, to humiliate them without killing one of their leaders, the sort of thing that we do see in a lot of tribal societies. But others have pointed out that this was not written about in John Smith's diaries there at Jamestown. It was only written about years later, after Princess Pocahontas had been married off to a Virginia planter and brought to England. To hear Smith tell it, though, this girl had clearly fallen in love with him, and he used that to the advantage of the English people, in his telling. He negotiated a new treaty by trading some bauble to the chief, and once again, the colony at Jamestown had peace and plenty. It was an amazing time, according to Smith. The sky was filled with rainbows, and gold fell from heaven. The Powhatan just kept throwing them parties, and all of the women really enjoyed themselves, and Smith, I heard, even tamed a wild unicorn. And then, tragedy. There was a sudden infestation of rats, and all of their grain spoiled, and a bunch of people died, all within only a few days. And this is the really embarrassing part, you guys. Right then is when the second supply mission showed up. Unexpectedly. I mean, everything was just amazing there in Jamestown, thanks entirely to John Smith and his powers of seduction over a 13-year-old, until like a week before you guys arrived. I know it looks bad, but trust me. Biographies of John Smith will point to this period before the second supply mission arrived as a time when things were great in Jamestown, but no evidence supports that claim except for the journals of John Smith. The journals of those who arrived paint a very different picture of a colony once again, thanks to Smith, on the brink of collapse. However, even though this mission was not commanded by Christopher Newport, they once again saved them by dropping off plenty of food and tools. They even dropped off a few German and Polish colonists. And as soon as the supply mission went back to England, once again everything was rainbows and unicorns under the wise and benevolent rule, the benevolent leadership of John Smith. Again, none of that's true. John Smith was a braggart, and he was a liar, and he wrote all of this years after the fact. He did so simply to secure his position in the company. For example, one of those German or Polish settlers warned John Smith of an impending attack from the Powhatan that he had seen signs of. John Smith did everything one does in that situation, called the men to arms, fired back on them, fought them off. But in his memoirs, after Pocahontas was in England and kind of famous, he says that Pocahontas sneaked into the fort, into his private chambers, you understand, to warn him of the danger approaching from her father's forces. None of that happened. John Smith was a disaster, and what was to come is going to prove it. See, the colonists were awaiting yet another supply mission, this time under Christopher Newport, and once again they had abandoned agriculture and begun digging for fool's gold. But that supply mission, which was to be their salvation, was the voyage of the Sea Venture. That's the ship that would crash so famously on the coast of Bermuda. Now that's the story that leads to the English colonization of Bermuda and, of course, William Shakespeare's play The Tempest. But for our purposes, it spelled disaster for the Jamestown settlers. Last time we discussed the foundation of the colony at Jamestown, mostly through the stories of Captain Sir Christopher Newport and John Smith. We left the Virginians there in a precarious situation. There were about 200 settlers alive, probably fewer at this point, and they continued to die at an alarming rate. They were low on everything: ammunition and fuel, space, but above all, they were low on food. The people were starving at Jamestown, and they were unable to do anything about it. They couldn't hunt, or fish even, due to the swampy nature of their land and to the hostility of the neighboring Powhatan people who would attack them if ever they left. The Powhatan had formerly been friends, but they were hostile toward the English at this point due to the incompetence of their leadership and the arrogance of the English people. This also prevented them from trading for food. The Powhatan had been their trading partners, but now the only people willing to trade with the English were almost a month away. The colonists were, at this point, relying exclusively on imports of supplies from England. They were growing their own food, but that still had some time before it could provide nearly enough to feed everyone. In early 1608, things were looking bleak for the people in Jamestown. Then, their expected supply ships failed to arrive. That fleet, led by Christopher Newport on the flagship Sea Venture, carried food and 400 additional settlers, and the man who was going to be the governor of Virginia. Thomas West, the 3rd Baron de la Warre, is going to be the first real political player in the story of Jamestown, but his role in today's story is going to be minimal. At least, it's going to be brief, but it will be impactful. The Sea Venture and the other ships in the fleet intended to bring supplies to America wrecked off the coast of Bermuda. All of those supplies that were intended for Virginia were stuck there in the middle of the Atlantic. When we left off, I had some harsh words for John Smith. My biases were front and center, mostly due to Smith's many failings in administration. But even more than that, really, was his tendency to tell untruths, is the polite word, but they were lies. They were propaganda. And today I tried to be fair to John Smith. I really did, but I'm going to warn you, that bias is only going to get worse. This is episode 153, The Scum of Men. Let's begin with John Smith's famous proclamation to the people of Jamestown. He that will not work shall not eat. Now that's a Bible reference, but Smith used it in a much more nefarious fashion. It was little more than a clever way for John Smith to deflect blame for the suffering of the people of Jamestown onto the colonists, to deflect it away from himself. Agriculture takes time, and, admittedly, the people of Jamestown wasted a lot of time digging for fool's gold and forcing the Powhatan to farm for them. Had they focused initially on growing crops, they would have plenty of food at this point, but they didn't. Now that they realized the situation they were in, though, it was still taking time for them to grow enough food to feed everyone, especially since more people had arrived. All of this, on some level, very much appears to be the fault of John Smith. So when their dear leader, and by this point John Smith was president of the council, when he says that he who does not work will not eat, that raises questions. Primarily, eat what? Their rapidly dwindling rations, they didn't have enough food to feed everybody. And John Smith didn't count the gathering of roots and herbs as work, and that's what most of the men needed to do to survive. Of course, John Smith made sure that those who had absolutely essential jobs got some of those rations. You know, those who, along with John Smith, sat around tables deliberating and signing papers. They got to eat. This began very quickly to look like the darkest days of the Soviet Union. But that took years. And when I say dark, I mean it gets really dark. By 1608, over 100 people had died at Jamestown, and it was going to get a lot worse. Into all of that, in August of 1609, 300 more settlers arrived. The majority of those settlers were from the wreck of the Sea Venture back on Bermuda. They'd dismantled their wrecked ships and built 2 new, smaller vessels to carry them to America. Now, Christopher Newport was still on Bermuda, dealing with the colonization efforts there, but the man in charge of this leg of the voyage was Lord de la Warr. He wasn't actually Lord de la Warr, he was his son, but when this character becomes a prominent player in our story, we'll be talking about him next time, he will be the Baron de la Warr. His job on this venture was to be the governor of Virginia, the acting governor under his father, who was officially governor for life. However, once he arrived there at Jamestown and saw the situation, saw the people starving, and realized that it was a very dangerous place to be, well, because of the wreck, you understand, there were issues to tend to back in England, so he had to set sail, and he did so immediately. Had he done so with the settlers whom he brought with him, and those who were currently starving in Jamestown, you know, it's fine to leave a token force behind with enough food to support themselves, but had he saved all of those people, I would laud the young Lord de la Warr as a hero. But that's not what he did. The people wanted to return with him. Those who just arrived looked around and saw how everything was here in Jamestown. They wanted to turn around and leave, but the young lordling forced them to stay. When they tried to leave anyway, he turned his guns and threatened them with violence. Then he turned around and took his ships with him, all but one vessel that belonged to a company of independent colonists, and 2 others that were too small to carry everybody home. And then, a few months later, John Smith was wounded in an explosion in his pack of gunpowder on his hip. He was badly burned, according to every report. I'm not sure I believe any of those reports, but I'm in the minority there. However, you may remember the gift that John Smith gave to Chief Powhatan last time, the gift that was the only thing keeping the colonists alive. But once John Smith left, the gift-giver was gone. Whether or not John Smith's injury was real, whether or not it was a tragic accident or intentionally nefarious, John Smith had just doomed his countrymen. And I'll pile on the horrific tragedy here by telling you that this particular group of colonists was almost entirely made up of families. There were women and children here, including one person I'd like you to take note of. We don't know her name, but we know that she was the 14-year-old daughter of a middle-class London family. Now, put yourself in the shoes of one of those colonists who had just arrived at Jamestown. When you joined the Virginia Company voyage to sail for America, you had high hopes for the future, and you had no idea of the real situation in Virginia. When you found out the reality of that situation, you tried to turn around, but Lord de War turned you back and took most of the ships back with him. And then the president, John Smith, told you of his policy. Those who do not work will not eat, but there's no food anyway, so what are you going to eat? And then that man who gave you that mandate sailed away. He had a whole ship to take him back to England, while you and all of your family and friends are slowly growing hungrier and hungrier. Not only that, some of his closest advisors accompanied him because they were necessary members of his party. You had just been abandoned to starve to death. I'd be angry about that, and the colonists were angry. Many of them were too hungry at this point to do anything about it, but a few of them who had a ship of their own, Plymouth men mostly, took that ship up north where they founded the first colony in what would become New England. Now they did so legally, under the auspices of the other Virginia Company, the Virginia Company of Plymouth. Nothing would come of that colony, and nothing would come of the Plymouth Company, but those men who left would make it safely back to England. At this point, there were only 2 ships left in the harbor there at Jamestown, out of a total 9 that had been there at one point, and neither of those ships was large. It was a hopeless situation. Now, I can't really condone or say that I agree with what was going to happen next, but I also can't blame those who did it. Donald Chamette writes in his book Pirates on the Chesapeake, quote, "By the fall of 1609, the colony, beset by political upheaval, Indian attacks, famine, disease, and weak leadership, was rapidly degenerating into total chaos. Starvation, laced with cannibalism, desertion, a lack of civil authority, and idleness, all but guaranteed the colony's failure. As one contemporary chronicler of the descent into piracy later wrote, and now quoting that chronicler, "Unto idleness you may join treasons wrought by those unhallowed creatures that forsook the colony and exposed their desolate brethren to extreme misery." End quote. The unhallowed creatures in question were a small group of men who, when they realized how bad things were in Jamestown, took their guns and marched inland. But they didn't do so to attack the Powhatan. They did so to trade with the Powhatan. Now, this was extremely dangerous. At this point, the Powhatan were killing any English people who left their island. But these men managed to talk their way to the chief's eldest son, who, if you haven't figured it out yet, was kind of an emissary. These English sailors had a deal to propose to the Powhatan. They were going to trade them the guns that they carried, along with a fair amount of powder and shot, and even show the Powhatan how to use them. What they wanted in return was some food, but they weren't doing so for the salvation of Jamestown. Had that been the case, I don't think the Powhatan would have agreed. Instead, and this is the juicy bit here, those men were going to take that food and leave. This group of men was still healthy and hale. That made them dangerous. Most of the people of Jamestown were too weak to fight, and many of those that weren't were women and children. Getting rid of these men without violence was a good deal. So those men were given the food they requested and led back to Jamestown. They were led back under guard, of course, to ensure that no treachery took place, but the Powhatan even helped them, under cover of darkness, load that food onto one of their ships. That evening they approached certain men in the colony, a few other kindred spirits, and they offered them a chance to escape. They only offered that to healthy men who knew their way around a ship, or at least knew their way around a musket. And when dawn came, that ship weighed anchor and sailed out of the harbor, into the Chesapeake, and out into the Atlantic. Much later, John Smith, writing from his comfortable convalescence with a full belly, would write in tones of deepest indignation, quote, "They stole away the ship. They made a league amongst themselves to be professed pirates with dreams of mountains of gold and happy robberies. Thus, at one instant, they wronged the hopes and subverted the cares of the colony, who, depending upon their return, foreslowed to look out for any further provision. They created the Indians our implacable enemies by some violence they offered. They carried away the best ship, which would have been a refuge in extremities. They weakened our forces by subtraction of their arms. They are the scum of men. Failing in their piracy, that being pinched with famine, after their wild roving upon the sea, when their lawless hopes failed, some remained with other pirates they met. The others resolved to return to England, bound themselves by mutual oath to agree all in one report, to discredit the land, to deplore the famine, and to protest that their coming away proceeded from desperate necessity." End quote. I know that in any discussion of history I'm supposed to be neutral. I'm supposed to leave my biases at the door, and I know that I'm not that good at it. But I really tried here. I tried to look at this from both angles, but I can't. I have to be honest with you. I hate John Smith. I despise him. Let's break down that little passage, shall we? The very first thing he does is deride these pirates for their dreams of mountains of gold, dreams that he made up because he was not there when these men left. He didn't know what was in their hearts, and beyond that, why was the Virginia Company in America in the first place, if not for mountains of gold? But of course those riches, those mountains of gold, are for men with pedigrees and sirs on their names, not the filthy commoners left to starve by Smith himself. Then he goes on to blame the pirates for making enemies of the Powhatan people, which they didn't. That was John Smith, who used the chief's son as a human shield. Now he bought peace for them, but he was the one that began the conflict with the Powhatan. And then John Smith denies, or at least attempts to downplay, the famine that his people were suffering. "Oh, sure, they're starving a bit, but it's nothing serious. Tighten your belts and haul yourselves up by your bootstraps, as any good peasant who knows their place would do." These men instead decided to leave, which, as we will see, is what saved their lives. And then he has the gall, when a few of them return to England with tales of starvation, tales that we know to be true and that John Smith was doing his best to hide from everyone, horrifying, unbelievable tales. John Smith has the gall to accuse them of coming up with a story and unifying behind it. This reminds me of the tactics used by the filthiest sort of politicians all across the world. Those who buy their way into power, or otherwise buy those in power, to ensure that everything stays as beneficial to those at the very top as possible. While people starve all across the world, while people die from needless wars and preventable causes, these people manage to secure all of the world's resources for themselves. That's the point. And that is what John Smith was defending in the Virginia Company. And when a few managed to escape through means that I will admit I don't find tasteful, but when they managed to escape and bring tales of the truth of what John Smith and his ilk had done, he painted them as conspirators and liars. He deflects all the blame for things that he was directly responsible for onto these pirates. And it worked. John Smith is still often lionized, despite his many abuses, as an American pioneer who, let's remember here, was a dashingly handsome blonde that championed the Indian cause. And Pocahontas, who, when Disney makes a movie about it, has to be old enough to be super hot without making it weird, even though it was pretty weird, well, she fell for her savior, John Smith. That's the story that we're told to believe, and it's a lie all perpetrated by Smith himself. George Percy had other opinions on the matter, most notably regarding John Smith and his character. He wrote, quote, "that many untruths concerning these surroundings have been formerly published, wherein the author hath not spared to appropriate many deserts to himself, which he never performed, and stuffed his relations with so many falsities and malicious detractions." End quote. Another opinion from the 1600s, but a generation or two after John Smith, comes from a man named Thomas Fuller. In his book, The Worthies of England, Fuller wrote that Smith's, quote, "perils, preservations, dangers, deliverances, they seem to me almost beyond belief, some beyond truth. Yet we have two witnesses to attest them, the prose and the pictures, both in his own book, and it soundeth much to the diminution of his deeds that he alone is the herald to publish and proclaim them." End quote. In fact, everyone who wrote about Captain John Smith had much the same opinion. Smith was an ambitious, unworthy, and vainglorious fellow. But all of these recriminations came as a response to his published journal, a journal that was a bestseller in England. John Smith wrote, in the third person, in defense of the accusations against him, quote, "He wisely prevented their policies, though he could not suppress their envies, yet so well he demeaned himself in this business, and his adversaries' malice, and those suborned to accuse him, accused his accusers of subordination. Many untruths were alleged against him, but being so apparently disproved, begat a general hatred in the hearts of the company against such unjust commanders. Many were the mischiefs that sprung daily from their ignorant, yet ambitious spirits." End quote. And every time that Smith wrote to refute another accusation added to the chorus of accusations, he had the same defense: that they were jealous of his greatness, that they were attempting to bring him down so they could replace him, and that they were, all of them, in league, hunting him as a witch. Still, that was the first recorded act of piracy in the English colonies. Now, of course, there had been acts of piracy involved on every English voyage to the Americas thus far, from Walter Raleigh to Richard Grenville, Christopher Newport, John Smith even. None of them were able to resist the allure of a bit of free plunder. But all of those raids took place elsewhere. None of them in Virginia, usually in the West Indies, but sometimes off the coast of Africa. And to me, all of them ring kind of false, as piracy goes. They were illegal, it was piracy, but they don't feel like pirates. They feel like white-collar crimes. Those were powerful men with lots of money and famous names that were going about their business, setting up a colony, but in the process they saw an opportunity to enrich themselves. An opportunity hundreds of leagues offshore that was not going to arouse any interest back home. If anyone even bothered to notice, these men had powerful backers in the Parliament and in the King's court. If someone did complain about this bit of piracy, no one who mattered here would face consequences. After all, Lord Muckety-Muck of, House Who's-It was too big to fail. On the other hand, it's difficult to say what the genuine intentions and actions of these pirates were. On its surface, even if we were to believe John Smith, I might not find their actions moral, or perhaps not even acceptable. But if you were in their shoes, starving to death alongside hundreds of others, and you had a chance to escape, what would you do? But I don't think that we can trust John Smith's account of events there at Jamestown. These men, it very much appears, took that ship and returned as quickly as possible to England, to warn the people there of what was happening in Jamestown and to attempt to get relief for their fellow colonists. And it was John Smith who, in his many lies to defend his own position, called them liars and had them prosecuted. His fear of taking even the smallest amount of blame led to the death of over 350 people and the unlawful persecution of 50 pirates. The people left at the colony at Jamestown, 300 of them at this point, were still starving. When relief finally arrived several months later, those 300 people were almost all dead. There were only 50 left alive, all of them on the brink of death. And how those 50 survived is, well, that's when this story gets really dark. Centuries later, an archaeological dig at the original Jamestown site found a cemetery that had been hidden away by those who brought the relief supplies, those who realized what had happened and realized that it was their fault and tried to hide it. They built a building on top of the cemetery. That building eventually fell apart, and remains were found underneath. The remains of dozens of people. And among them they found the bones of that 14-year-old girl I mentioned earlier. They did a forensic analysis on all of these, and on that 14-year-old girl they found signs that are suggestive of, to say they prove it is difficult, but certainly suggest very strongly that she suffered a death very much like that of livestock. That is to say that this girl, in the final days of this initial attempt at the colonization of Jamestown, was butchered like an animal for her meat. And she wasn't alone. Others were cannibalized by the cream of Jamestown, the highest-ranking people left in the colony, so that those who mattered would be allowed to survive. That's the fate that John Smith and Lord de la Warr and all of the heads of the Virginia Company, and even to a lesser extent, though I hate to admit it, Christopher Newport, that's the fate that they abandoned the first colonists of Jamestown to. One group of men escaped in an attempt to save their own lives and perhaps the lives of their fellow colonists, while another group forced that fate on them and then lied about it to cover their own skin. The scum of men, indeed. Next time, we're going to continue on with the colony on the Chesapeake as it expands into new territories and eventually new colonies. I'd like to thank everybody for listening. I'd like to thank everybody who has helped to support the show, everybody who has signed up to become a patron on Patreon or signed up to support the show through the website, which, by the way, at very long last is finally back up and running at full potential. I'd also like to thank everybody who has recommended this show to your friends or family, and everybody who has left us a rating or a review wherever you listen to the show. That helps get the show noticed, and without all of you, this show wouldn't be possible. Thank you. Our theme music was, as always, The Old Captain by the fantastic band Brillig. If you haven't checked them out yet, you absolutely should do so. You can find them at brillig.com.au. That's brillig.com.au. After you're done over there, why not check out our website at piratehistorypodcast.com, or you can get in touch on Twitter, SoundCloud, Reddit, or YouTube. As always, most importantly, thank you for listening.